Anger greeted two men accused of murdering a University of the Western Cape student as they appeared in court. The duo is also charged with killing her grandfather. The bodies of Jesse Hess and Chris Lategan were found in Parow in August, following what appeared to be a house robbery.
The faithful gathered side by side, raising a unified voice against crime and violence. The gathering in front of the Parow police station follows the recent wave of femicide across the country. 19-year-old UWC student Jesse Hess and her grandfather were found murdered in their Parow flat.
I feel like jail is just a luxury life for them. It's just going to be luxury because outside for them this was jail. For them inside is what they know as luxury life. So for me, I think death penalty needs to come back after justice has been served for us.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me here again today. Last week we spoke about the very, very sad and tragic case of Tariq Jacobs. But if you haven't seen that, I will link it up here for you. But that case is all about how you expect those closest to you to protect you, but it turns out that that was the complete opposite for the young 2-year-old boy. But today we are talking about a case that is just disgusting, cruel, and nonsensical. And today we are talking about the case of Jesse Hess. So buckle up because it's going to be a lot. And with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
For today, we are heading to Parow in Cape Town. Here, a young theology student from the University of the Western Cape stayed with her granddad in her home in Parow. And it is August of 2019. Jesse Hess is 19 at the time, and she lives with her granddad, who is 85 years old at the time. Jessie was described as excitable, happy-go-lucky, and so excited for her future. She was said to always look forward to what life had to offer, and Jessie's stepsister said, quote, her presence, being around her, was absolutely amazing. It was a dream being around her. It actually made you feel better being around her because just her bubbly personality made you forget about everything that was going on in just a split second. End quote. There are some articles that stated that Jessie wanted to become a priest later on in life, and she was also said to be a very spiritual person. Jesse Hess had this aura and this light around her that just drew people in and always made people feel better being in her presence. People felt safe and comfortable in Jessie's presence, and this was the light that she brought in to so many people's lives. But sadly, in August of 2019, someone would destroy Jessie's light and leave a dark sadness over those who loved her the most. So let's get into what happened in August of 2019. Jessie was at home with her granddad on the 30th of August 2019, when all of a sudden Jessie's granddad, who I probably haven't named in this video yet, but Jessie's granddad's name is Chris Lategan, so Jesse Hess and Chris Lategan. So Chris hears a knock at the door, and he then gets up to go and see who's knocking at his front door. Now, this man who is knocking at the door is just an absolute piece of work, but two men were actually at the door. One named David van Boven, and the second name, his name was Taslim Boonkie Ambrose. Now, both of these men apparently were high, and they went to Chris Lategan's house because they wanted to actually see what they could steal and what they were able to get from Chris in order to fuel their apparent drug habits. David van Boven was apparently a member of the 28th gang here in Cape Town, and he is just absolutely vile and nasty. But when they waited for Chris Lategan to open the door, he then opens it, and Taslim and David then storm into the house. David then apparently pushes the older 85-year-old man to the floor, and apparently they went absolutely mad. It is unclear whether at this point Jessie heard the commotion and she then came out, but she did eventually come out. But it's also unclear whether when she came out of the room that she was in, that her grandfather was alive at the time, or he had already passed away by this point. But now there's two men in the house, David and Taslim, and Jessie's at the back of the house, and they've now just stormed in and pushed Chris Lategan, the 85-year-old man, to the ground. One of the men then apparently took a belt and put it to Chris Lategan's neck and just pulled and pulled as tight as they could. and they pulled this belt so tightly around Chris's neck that his blood vessels all popped in his face, and especially around the eye area because there was a lot of blood coming from his eyes as well. And when I was busy writing down what I was going to say and researching this case, I kid you not that it was very tough to read what they did to Chris Lategan, because I am grateful that I still have a grandfather, and he is a couple years younger than Chris Lategan was at the time, but he's still my granddad, and it is very difficult to hear what they did to this older gentleman, and also how much he suffered by the hands of people who were just looking to get high. But sadly, Jesse Hess's passing was also just as gruesome and as torturous. Like I said earlier, Jessie at some point must have heard the commotion because she came out of a back room. And I think Jessie's presence must have startled the men because I don't think they expected Jessie to be home at the time. But apparently one of the men then grabbed Jessie, and she must have made a lot of noise because they pushed a sock into her mouth as well as a pillowcase. So they really tried to keep her as quiet as they could. And they also then tied tape around her head. So from the base of the chin all the way to the top of her head was tied around in duct tape with the sock and the pillowcase still in her mouth. And then also on top of this, she was also strangled to death with the same belt that her grandfather was just murdered with as well. And when an autopsy was done on Jessie Hess's body later on, knew that she passed away from asphyxiation. However, what caused her asphyxiation was difficult to determine because she could have passed away from the gag in her mouth and then the duct tape being taped around, because I assume they tried to not let her breathe, but also she could have been murdered from the belt around her neck and being strangled to death. However, when Jessie was found, she was found naked from the waist down, and the later autopsy, the doctor would assume that she had. But when the doctor would later take a closer look, he would say that he found little to no evidence of tearing. So he couldn't definitively say that she was. However, the position that she was lying in, the fact that she was naked from the waist down, was probably a strong indicator that she was. And during the later court date, he would say that it is possible if the perpetrator wore a condom, that because he wore a condom, there would be less tearing and less trauma to the specific area. The doctor performing the autopsy also couldn't conclude whether Jessie was passed out at the point that she was, because if she was unconscious, there would be less trauma as well because she was not fighting back. So absolute carnage was left by these two men trying to find some trinkets or something to sell in this older gentleman's house just for them to get high. Now this case does get worse and even more disgusting than what we've just heard. And the reason being is that David and Taslim were actually really well known to the police, and they were in and out of prison, especially David. David had previously just been released in December of 2018. And to make matters even worse, David was very well known to Chris Lategan and to Jessie Hess because David was Jessie Hess's second cousin. I know, how vile. Now, police were called to the scene and they worked very hard to get this case rolling and to try and figure out who murdered Jessie Hess and her 85-year-old grandfather. However, police could only find circumstantial evidence in the home. They were able to pick up partial fingerprints in the home, but a lot of the scene had been contaminated by the perpetrators because there was a lot of walking over the bodies, moving them to find valuables, and also a lot of the stuff in the house had been taken. But the partial fingerprints were taken by the police and they were taken back to the lab for further investigation. But David van Boven would prove to be so vile, so heinous, and just so arrogant that he basically gave himself up to police because of what he did, and he made it so easy for police to catch him. Now, I'll play you the clip of how exactly he was caught, and it's just disgusting.
Good evening, Shahan. Well, on Monday, there was an incident that took place in Hanover Park on the Cape Flats, and two teenagers were attacked by a man known to them. He tied both their hands, and the 16-year-old was and the 19-year-old was physically assaulted by this person. He then fled on foot and jumped into a taxi, and community members then alerted the police, and the next day this man was arrested, and he was then linked by police through circumstantial evidence to the double murder, the murder of Jessie Hess, who was a student at the University of the Western Cape, and her 85-year-old grandfather.
Now, clearly David needs to be taken off of the streets, because David van Boven has no remorse and he clearly has a taste for this specific crime. But that is how David van Boven was caught, and he was then taken into custody, and Taslim was then captured a few days later while he was on the run, because David van Boven gave him up to police because he had the attitude that if I go down, you're going down. So the two were now arrested and taken to jail, and the trial then began. The father of Jessie Hess, whose name is Lance Hess, he said that him and his family have gone through absolute hell with the loss of their daughter. And hearing the details in court about what David and Taslim did was absolutely traumatizing to the family. Lance Hess then said, quote, "When I heard the first statement of David, I could not sleep. It was very hurtful to hear how they were viciously attacked so that these two could fuel their drug habit. They could have just taken their stuff, and kill my child." Lance then went on to say, quote, "I believe Taslim Ambrose's version, that David took him there and that it was his idea to attack them, but I have so many questions," end quote. And the version of the story that Lance Hess believes from Taslim is that yes, they both did go and rob Chris and Jessie of their belongings, but Taslim said that he never murdered anybody and that was never his intention. He said that when they got to Chris's house, David was like an absolutely possessed man, and that he said that David knew exactly why he was going there, and that while Taslim robbed the place, David went on a murder rampage. So Taslim said that he and David went to Chris Lategan's house, and Chris then opened the door for them. David then asked Chris for something to eat, while Chris said there wasn't much in the house, but he made them both tea to drink. Taslim then said that while he and David were sat at the kitchen table, David then jumped over the table and attacked Chris. Taslim then said that while David was attacking Chris Lategan, that he heard a young girl's voice from the back near the bathroom. He said that Jessie Hess then came out of the bathroom with a towel covering her hair, but she was fully clothed at the time. Taslim then said that Jessie ran into the bathroom and David chased after her, and loud screams were heard before he saw frightened Jessie run to the front door. Jessie then tried to run outside the house, but David stopped her from getting out. David then turned to Jessie to say that it was only a joke. Jessie then turned to David and said, "You don't make jokes like that," end quote. Taslim then said that David all of a sudden then grabbed Jessie by the shoulder, pulled her down, and described it like a rugby tackle, where David then forced his shoulder into Jessie's stomach, where she then buckled over. While Jessie was then trying to catch her breath from what David had just done, David then took her shoelaces and tied her hands and feet together. He then picked up Jessie and took her into the bedroom. As David was busy carrying Jessie, he then turned to Taslim. He must then take the TV and he won't be long. Taslim then said that he saw this as an opportunity for him to escape as well. But sadly, Taslim's hopes were dashed, because when he got to the front door, he noticed that David had already removed the key and was in the room with him and Jessie. When the door eventually opened, Taslim said that he saw Jessie sitting scared in the corner of the room, and her pants were removed. Taslim then said, quote, "She sat doodstil. She said nothing." And doodstil in English means literally dead still. So these are conflicting reports from the doctor and Taslim, but either one could be possible. Apparently, Taslim also gave up a description of the layout of the house in Paro, which matched the evidence handed up in court. Taslim also heard Jessie give David the PIN to her bank card. Taslim then said after that, quote, "After he took me home, I was sick. I'm not a violent person, but I was scared to run away because he knows those areas very well, and I did what he told me to do. I was scared he would find me. He gave me 1,000 rand after he sold the stuff and told me to shh." There were also reports that Taslim was crying in court. He was so scared of David because Taslim said that David had connections in Pollsmoor prison. he was reportedly a member of the 28th gang. So if Taslim and David were in the same prison, there is a chance that David could order a hit on Taslim in order to not make him testify in court. Taslim also reportedly struggled in the first part of the trial because the trial is in English and that was not his first language and there were no Afrikaans interpreters available. So the trial was postponed until a later date when a translator was available, and that was sometime in November of 2019, and then postponed again to May of this year. Both men were found guilty, and David van Boven was found guilty of both murders, 2 counts of robbery with aggravating circumstances, assault, and fraud. Taslim Ambrose was found guilty of 2 counts of robbery, but only as an accessory after the fact and not found guilty of the rest of the charges. Both David and Taslim would have to wait until June of this year for sentencing, and that is the horrific, tragic, and senseless crime of Jesse Hess and Chris Lategan. And these cases really just infuriate because, like so many cases we've spoken about on this channel, criminals go that extra step in order to really hurt and torture their victims when it is completely unnecessary. But let me know what you think of this case down below. We will do a short recap of the case once the trial has concluded. But I hope you're all staying safe. Thank you for watching the video this far if you are still here. And I'll see you again next week. Bye.